You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 301 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Joining me on today's show is Keith Knight. He is the host of the Don't Tread on Anyone podcast and the co-host of Liberty Weekly with Patrick McFarland, who's been a guest on this show, and I've been a guest on that show. So, Keith, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Kyle.
You've done a lot of great foreign policy work. There's an interview with Scott Horton that I've talked about in the past on this show, and I know I've recommended. It's probably been a few months now that everybody listened to. So if you haven't got a chance to check that out yet, Scott even expresses in the show that he's impressed with Keith's vast knowledge on these foreign policy issues. On today's show, I have him for this new slideshow presentation he did. That's extremely well done. I rewatched it this morning and I remembered how impressed I was with it. It's titled, America's Foreign Policy of Deception, and it'll be linked in the show notes page. And that and his ultimate red pill video are the two things that I really push for you to go to. Both of those videos will be linked in the show notes page. I think both are pretty close to the front of his, YouTube feed. So you should be able to find them there. So Keith, what we're going to be doing today is just, kind of going over a bunch of war myths, our, different false flag efforts, and, really look through America's, full history of war deception here. So I actually want to start with the first one in your video. We're not going to be able to hit all of them because this is it's an hour long. The video is fast paced. There's so much in there. But the first one is probably the one that even a lot of those in the anti-war movement don't know. They maybe think at the start of the American Empire or American expansionism being the Spanish-American War. But here we actually look towards the Polk presidency. If anybody even knows who James K. Polk is, very few know what he's done. But apparently he started a war. So why don't you start off there, Keith?
So basically in 1847, there was the Lincoln Spot Resolution, and I'm reading off notes here because I don't want to go astray from the truth. And basically, Abraham Lincoln was questioning this statement by James Polk, referring to an invasion, saying, "We have been invaded. Our territory has been invaded, and they shed American blood upon American soil." The Lincoln Spot Resolution was basically asking for proof, reasoning, or evidence of this. This was, at the time, Congressman Abraham Lincoln. And this war resulted in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which is where the U.S. expanded its territory into New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado, and Wyoming. So going all the way back, we have an example of a claim made by a high-level official, the president, that there was no grounds for legitimacy on. So that is interesting in the sense of you clearly see the incentive for the deception when you see the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the fact that it was based on something that there was no evidence for really gives you a bird's eye view into what's coming up.
So I guess we're going to skip forward 70 years plus or minus here to World War I and kind of the American entry there. One of the things that you bring up in your presentation that I think is pretty common, and if we look at the past presidents, it's something that I've discussed on the show in past, just that anti-war is the way to go if you want to get elected. So can you talk a little bit about Woodrow Wilson's campaign promises looking to get reelected a second time?
Well, according to WoodrowWilsonHouse.org /1916, you can see what he ran on. And it basically was, he's kept us out of war, meaning there's been a big war and he's kept us out. Notice it wasn't saying that it's justified. It's just saying he's kept us out, as in peace is inherently good. So, in 1915, the year prior, the Lusitania was actually sunk. Now, this happened May 7th, 1915, and it killed 128 Americans along with many others. And in 1982, that's important because it goes to show you how long the deception can go on. In 1982, the London National Archives released evidence that there actually were munitions on board. So far from it being just a civilian passenger ship that, was having, butter and just transporting cotton, this was actually could have been categorized as a military ship. Doesn't justify killing innocent people, but that's another lie. Now, this image right here, you can see the "He kept us out of war" button, as well as this little advertisement that the German ministry actually took money to put out in American newspapers. They basically said if America enters the war on behalf of Britain, we don't have a fighting chance. So we're going to spend some resources trying to let them know, hey, don't go on the Lusitania. It specifies the ship not to go on. Now, that day, the Lusitania was sunk, May 7th, 1915. There was a discussion between Colonel House, who Woodrow Wilson referred to as his second personality, and a conversation was with Sir Edward Grey, the top British diplomat. And in the intimate papers of Colonel Edward House, it actually says, on the morning of May 7th, House and Grey drove out to Kew. We spoke of the probability of an ocean liner being sunk, recorded House, and I told him if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep across America, which would in itself probably carry us into war. In other words, hint, hint. He then said, suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board. That was the day of before it happened. That is according to that's page 432 of the intimate papers of Colonel House. That was published by Yale University. So another example of a primary source that has a lot of credit behind it, Yale University, that just goes unmentioned. Also, Neville Chamberlain's cousin wrote a book, Room 40, in which he concludes that the ocean liner was sent there intentionally. So another war based on a deception.
I think something important here too is that, as you say, this information doesn't come out till 70 years later or 60 something years later. And so imagine how much different the conversation would have been at the time had this information been known.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember this war led us to a draft under the guise of Woodrow Wilson's April 6th, 1917 speech, making the world safe for democracy. So there was a draft, and it led to the deaths of 117,000 American soldiers. So first of all, it sort of throws a wrench in the patriarchy, male privilege, idea. And second, it goes to show you 117,000 deaths based on a lie. Like that is so big. And Woodrow Wilson is still seen as this progressive who was so forthcoming. He gave us the income tax. He was kind enough to give us a Federal Reserve, stopping German militarism and the Kaiser. So big deception, very important stuff.
Right. Well, and we could probably spend a whole show now just talking about what happened in the next 30 years or so about how World War I and the U.S. entry really screwed everything up. But I want to skip over most of the World War II myths, except the big one. And this is one I was only convinced of what I think your position is now very recently. Scott Horton did an episode with Sheldon Richmond on it, and Adam Graham, a friend of mine, wrote a pretty decent article on it that was published at the Libertarian Institute. Both of those things will be linked in the show notes page. But why don't you go ahead and give us kind of the shorter breakdown and debunking of the Pearl Harbor attack?
So this is a case of a deception. I'm not necessarily saying, National Socialism in Germany wasn't a force to be reckoned with. I'm just saying this is a deception that the U.S. was attacked, surprisingly, and brought into war against what our initial desires were. It's like we wanted to stay out, but then we were just pulled in, and this is why you can't be isolationist. January 2nd, 1972, a article called War Entry Plans Laid to Roosevelt. New York Times comes out publishing 950 volumes from the British War Cabinet papers. The article reads, President Franklin Roosevelt told Prime Minister Winston Churchill in August of 1941 that he was looking for an incident to justify opening hostilities against Nazi Germany. Churchill quotes Roosevelt saying Roosevelt, obviously was determined that they should come in. He would become more and more provocative if the Germans did not like it and they could attack American forces. Everything was to be done to force an incident. In 1954, Rear Admiral Robert A. Theobald quotes Secretary of War Henry Stimson saying, in a subsequent meeting, Stimson said, the question was how we should maneuver them, the Japanese, into the position of firing the first shot. This is Secretary of War speaking. In 1982, John Toland published the book Infamy, and he quotes Secretary of War Stimson again, saying, we face the delicate question of the diplomatic fencing to be done so as to be sure Japan is put into the wrong and makes the first bad move, overt move. So in 1999, fast forward, a book comes out by Robert Stinnett called Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor, in which he releases a document called the McClellan Memo. And he basically says, here are 8 things we can do to get Japan to strike first. Now, what could be dismissed as, all right, so there was some kook in the military. What's that prove? What happened was 7 of the 8 items were implemented. That is prima facie evidence that this was the policy to get Japan to make the first move because they wanted to get into the war anyways. So this is, the major one was the Export Control Act of 1940 and U.S. and Britain freezing Japanese assets. Unbelievable stuff. Absolutely unbelievable. And that was 20 years ago now. The McClellan Memo came out. So when they're obsessed with Russia and, Russia's this and Stormy Daniels that, once you start learning this stuff, you just start laughing at how, this is unprecedented. The FBI is investigating Trump. Oh, heavens. So ridiculous. The wars are based on lies and they end in millions of dead and total destruction of property. So, yeah, that's the Pearl Harbor lie.
Talking about, those kind of just like, the Trump saying like, terrible things is unprecedented. I want to talk about one of the most probably disgusting things to happen in U.S. history here with the experiments that were done in St. Louis during the Cold War.
This is some pretty heavy stuff. So we have what was called Operation LAC, standing for Large Area Coverage. This was a U.S. Army Chemical Corps operation which dispersed microscopic zinc cadmium sulfide particles over much of the United States. The purpose was to determine the dispersion and geographic range of biological or chemical agents. In 1950, 1952, and in 1957, these were done in South Carolina, Georgia, on the east coast of Britain, the San Francisco Bay Area, St. Louis, and Minnesota. How dare they? Where our good friend Patrick McFarland lives, in Minnesota. This is another part of this operation was called Operation DEW, D-E-W, referring to 2 separate field trials conducted by the United States in the 1950s. The tests were designed to study the behavior of aerosol-released biological agents. Other things to research, Project 112 took place between 1951 and 1952. That was the operation in Georgia and South Carolina. Basically, in the mid-1950s, and again a decade later, the U.S. Army motorized blowers atop a low-income housing high-rise at schools and from the backs of station wagons to send a potentially dangerous compound into the already hazy air in predominantly black areas of St. Louis. Local officials were told at the time the government was testing a smoke screen that could shield St. Louis from aerial observation in case of the Russians attack. So in other words, they were doing something under the guise of, there's a foreign enemy that might do something bad, so we're just protecting you. Meanwhile, they're spraying us with stuff that is absolutely cancerous. But in 1994, the government said the tests were part of a biological weapons program, and St. Louis was chosen because it bore some resemblance to Russian cities that the U.S. might attack. The material being sprayed was zinc, cadmium sulfide, a fine fluorescent powder. So, when someone says, I'm thinking our chemtrails may be real, there's a big history of this, also including Operation Trail Dust and Operation Ranch Hand in Vietnam, where they're just spraying Agent Orange indiscriminately on South Vietnam. So that's another one a lot of our professors collectively forgot to mention.
Yeah, I do want to move into Agent Orange next. I just want to take a time and to point out that last little piece you said. I grew up in St. Louis, and it's not like this was something that like we talked about as far as Civil War history goes. There's one paper, the Riverfront Times, which would be like, the non-establishment paper, the bad page ads there are, for escort services or whatever, but they would do some writing on it. But other than that, it really wasn't something that was talked about or taught. But you would think it'd be a very important part of history here. Make sure like you keep up with, the fear levels the government's putting up and what kind of powers they're giving them because they're willing to give you cancer.
I'm sure it's for the collective good, though. So Operation Ranch Hand, part of Operation Trail Dust, was largely inspired by the British use of 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D during the Malayan emergency in the 1950s. It was part of the overall herbicidal warfare program during the war called Operation Trail Dust. Ranch Hand involved spraying an estimated 20 million gallons of defoilments and herbicides over rural areas of South Vietnam in an attempt to deprive the Viet Cong of food and vegetation cover. So, yeah, maybe there's bad people in a certain area. It doesn't justify indiscriminately spraying, cancer everywhere. Areas of Laos and Cambodia were also sprayed to a lesser extent. Nearly 20,000 sorties were flown between 1961 and 1971. The method used was a C-119 flying boxcar, the type of plane used to release the chemicals. Incredible stuff. Incredible stuff.
Right. And I just want to, add in here that there is another kind of myth, or I guess something that just was never talked about. In the Vietnam War, we had the bombing of Cambodia. Well, Gareth Porter recently did an episode with Scott Horton on kind of Gareth's historical reporting of the Vietnam era and of the war in Cambodia. And I guess what was happening is the bombs in Cambodia were making these divots and they would fill in with water. And then it would be like just mosquito nests that went around and spread all kinds of, different diseases. And so, it wasn't, actually biochemical warfare, but certainly, it ran a bombing campaign that spread to all these diseases and tons of Cambodians died from it. And so, these programs that they have where, you think they sell it as, oh, we're just killing vegetation. That way we're not killing people. Or we're just bombing the enemy. There's so many other consequences of it. Like if you look even today at like just image search Agent Orange and probably Vietnamese children, and you'll see some things that are absolutely shocking to you. I want to move to some stuff closer. This one is, I think, from our childhood here, the anthrax scare. This is something that I remember. I was a kid. I was probably in elementary school, maybe middle school when this happened, but this one scared me.
So, the anthrax bug, it's important to have the, background of the Cold War experiments. The anthrax attack bug, according to the Daily News, May 9th, 2002, was identical to an Army strain by Deborah McKenzie. In other words, what the anthrax was identical to something at a U.S. bioweapons lab. The likelihood of this being a coincidence is probably in the billions from what the researchers suggest. So it's very, very likely that this was a false flag used to create fear among the populace to justify going to war. This is often done. This is often done to give people the idea that no matter the atrocity committed, anything is justified because 9/11, because anthrax, they're so bad. Therefore, carpet bombings, fire bombings, even nukings are justified.
Well, that is a point that you made in your presentation, and something that I did want to talk about as the overall theme from your presentation. It's just that they have to tell such outrageous lies to lie us into war, whether that being soldiers throwing bayonets, babies around on bayonets, or Gaddafi giving his army Viagra so they could continue to rape women in these mass rape atrocities. And so then the enemy is so evil, it pretty much justifies doing whatever. Gaddafi is going to kill every single man, woman, and child in Benghazi. And so if Barack Obama's humanitarian intervention could save half of them, well, then it's more morally justified and a giant victory. It should be praised. And, look at the actual consequences of what happened. And, now we know that he wasn't going to kill everybody in Benghazi, and there were deals to be made there to resolve that situation. And so I don't know if you have anything more to say about it, but I think it's a brilliant point that the lies are just so extreme that it justifies anything.
Yeah, they definitely are extreme. The one that comes to mind when babies and bayonets, another World War I lie from a document titled Report on German Atrocities, also known as the Bryce Report, was the 1991 babies in incubators lie. Turns out the nurse giving this testimony to the Human Rights Council basically fabricated the story from a public relations firm called Hill and Knowlton. She turned out to be the daughter of the U.S. Kuwaiti ambassador. And it just goes to show you, this was a lie repeated by President Bush, Father George Bush, and 7 senators unapologetically. So, just goes to show you absolute lies that kill tons of people. And that's the intervention was very short, the Gulf War, but the sanctions that lasted a decade killed between 100,000 and 500,000 Iraqis. At least 33 9/11s because of those sanctions. So you can kind of see the Bill Clinton peacetime president, or Bush Sr. being this heroic man whose funeral we need to mourn. Absolute garbage.
Well, and then too, I guess also on the morality thing, the people telling these lies, if you're willing to tell that kind of lie because you think it's the right thing to go into Iraq, imagine what else you're willing to say and do. You know why? Because somebody knew about this lie into Iraq. Hillary Clinton, I'm pretty sure it turns out she was aware of Dennis Kucinich's efforts with the Dutch to try to work out a deal to prevent what would have to be the violent overthrow of Gaddafi to resolve the situation there. And so, the facts are known. They were known at the time, and they told these lies. So it's pretty obvious that, these politicians are just horrific people. All right. Well, the next one I always find interesting, and I think you tell this story very well. That's why I want you to bring this up. I don't know if it's a myth or a lie, but it's certainly a very interesting chapter, I guess, in the terror wars. And that's Wesley Clark telling us about this Pentagon report, 5 countries in 7 years.
So I forget the woman's name, Amy something, who works for Democracy Now! Total shill. But she got this.
I believe it's Amy Goodman, right?
Amy Goodman. Yes, thank you. So she's talking to Wesley Clark, who is a retired 4-star U.S. Army general, Supreme Allied Commander. And on March 2nd, 2007, he goes, so after 9/11, I'm in the Pentagon talking with people, and I asked a fellow there, hey, so are we going to invade Iraq? The reason he asked this is because Rumsfeld, on the afternoon of 9/11, said, get best info fast. Ask Paul Wolfowitz on how we can link Saddam to this. Any means necessary. That's according to CBS. Wesley Clark asked this guy, hey, are we going into Iraq? To which he responded, it's worse than that. We are going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran. This is wildly coincidental. First of all, we have the Syria invasion, which we're experiencing now based on those false chemical weapons lies. You have constant intervention in Lebanon with Israel, with Libya. Obviously, we saw, he died. Then you have Somalia, one of the many countries, one of the 7 countries on the Obama drone list, the secret kill list titled Disposition Matrix. Sudan, I don't have a lot of information on. And then Iran, you constantly see, even today, Iran is building up nuclear reactors. Yeah, so is America and Israel. And Israel lied about having a nuclear arsenal. And in 1986, Mordecai Vanunu came out and exposed the whole thing. Then they put him in jail, not for lying, but for treason, going against the country. So that is another case of a high-level official saying, hey, look at the information I have. And everyone going, all right, back to, the Obama said there were 57 states or some ridiculous thing. Steve King says, "Why is white nationalism bad?" Fake news is the perfect title for everything that we see. Don Lemon almost in tears because of the FBI investigation into Trump Russia. So it's all fake. It's all fabricated. They're psychopathic murderers.
Right. And I just want to comment on Sudan real quick. I mean, I know the country was split in two to Sudan and South Sudan. And it has a lot to do with like the oil interests where that country was split. Of course, now the war criminal running the South Sudan is a completely insane man. I'm sure you've seen, he looks a little bit like Sheriff Clark, who's also a human rights criminal, I guess. But he wears like the cowboy hat. He's a black guy with like a goatee. And so he's the thug in charge of South Sudan. And of course, I believe he's like photographed with Hillary Clinton and all that, and was, that was part of the U.S. separation there. I mostly want to say this is the reason I've been cautious about my, discussions on the protests going on in Sudan right now. I know Bashar, the ruler of that country, is certainly a long-time war criminal, but at the same time, who knows what's going to come out of it and what's actually driving those protests and how much of it is kind of this, NGO driven America, Western proxy stuff going on, and how much of it is, legitimate, uprising of the people looking for a better way to live their lives. We got just a couple more, and this one I thought was in my naivety in the beginning of the Obama administration, I saw like what the story was here and was astounded that this didn't end the Obama administration, or at least send Eric Holder to jail. So this is the Fast and Furious scandal. And I always like to point out that, U.S. drug war and all of our policies there really do impact foreign policy, because we're going to see, that dead Mexicans pile up.
So yes, Project Fast and Furious. This was titled ATF Gun Walking Scandal by the media, and it's known as Project Gunrunner, in which 723 guns were given to the Mexican drug cartel by the ATF. Now, this is a perfect example of, people hearing something and not really being able to process it because they don't have the historical context. So what you have is a constant arming of enemies, just arming a ton of different people, hoping a situation will arise that's negative, that will justify your intervention. This also happened with Operation Timber Sycamore in Syria, with arming the Free Syrian Army against the genocidal Assad. And which, by the way, yes, I'm sure he's bad. He's a politician, as is Saddam. But if it's really a justified war, why do they have to lie about it? So Operation Fast and Furious is important to understand, because you have U.S. government protectors, Mexican drug cartel, the bad guys. And when you see the good guys arming the bad guys, you have to question, hold on, are they really enemies? Or what was this whole thing about? So just imagine, Trump getting caught, sending, things to Russia or something like trivial that the media would freak out about. This is pretty big. They're funding terrorist groups in Syria, and they're funding the Mexican drug cartel with guns, not just money that, this was non-lethal aid, as they sometimes call it. This was lethal aid to the Mexican drug cartel. This was under the guise of, this was supposed to be a sting operation. Imagine anyone else doing that. You trade with a group that is a group of psycho mass murderers, and you're like, no, I was actually working against them. The people you're aiding, you're against, really? Wouldn't that go under the Trading of the Enemies Act of 1917? Just another example of deception and criminality.
Right. Well, in the sting operation, you would think, I forget what the guy's name, Chris something, who did To Catch a Predator, there weren't actually little kids at the place to get raped. Obama actually gave these thugs like automatic weapons and insane stuff like this. So, we're not talking about, they did do the sting operation right. Maybe, if they like cut the firing pins off the weapons or something before they give them out. At least then you could say we didn't give them, armed and ready to go weapons, but that's exactly what they did. That's not a sting operation. That's just arming thugs.
Yeah. Now you can also see Eric Holder saying, on C-SPAN one time, that the goal is to brainwash, literally uses the term brainwash, American citizens to not like guns. We have Obama saying we need background checks, we need licenses, we need gun restrictions as they're shipping guns that he believes should be illegal, or by illegal he means the state should have a monopoly. I wonder what the background check was on the Mexican drug cartel. I wonder what kind of licensing they had to apply for to get those guns. It's so fake when you see their actions. So, yeah, unbelievable stuff.
I always got a kick out of Obama's one of the biggest arm dealers in history is telling me that I can't have an AR-15. Screw you. You just sold how many big ass bombs to Mohammed bin Salman? I don't want to hear it. All right. So we got one more to get through today. And this one's an important one, in the terror war saga. And I don't think I've actually discussed it on the show yet. That's why I want to finish up here with the underwear bomber. And, there was some ways to stop this one, huh?
Were there some? Yeah, you can always stop something by not participating in it. So, according to The Guardian, Tuesday, May 8th, 2012, important to realize the story's not been redacted and it's not been given any immediate attention as, well, this claim was made, now there's a debate. According to The Guardian, underwear bomber was working for the CIA. Bomber involved in plot to attack U.S.-bound jet was working as an informant with Saudi intelligence and the CIA, it has emerged, by Paul Harris and Ed Pinkleton in New York. Also, Operation Ajax was done in 1953 with Roosevelt's nephew, Kermit Roosevelt. And this is the sort of thing that happened. They would arm these radicals in an attempt to justify, the overthrowing of Mossadegh. So we're seeing what they've done in other countries happen here. This is a primary example of it. Now, is this true? Probably, because it hasn't been redacted and it hasn't been exposed as the Guardian's making our intelligence agencies look bad. This is, terrible. Let's have this CIA analyst on James Clapper. James Clapper going, oh, this is horrible. More lies, more lies. So obviously something like that would happen if this was fake news. You got a big media source making a big claim, hasn't been refuted. It's probably true.
Right. And The Guardian isn't even like The Intercept, or, as hacky as The Intercept could be, they will publish stuff that like goes against the state. The Guardian is, they're the ones who put out all these stories about Assange and Manafort and all the other ridiculous stuff. So this is a mainstream newspaper, this would be like the New York Times saying it. It's against interest. You could likely believe that if it goes unchallenged. And I think there's been further evidence coming out that, the Americans knew about this. They could have stopped them from getting on the plane. They let them get on the plane. And, it was just a big fat nothing. But it certainly is just one of those things they cite to justify, this never ending terror war. Well, Keith, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm glad to have you on. Hopefully I'll have you back on in the future. You make great stuff. So if you ever do anything foreign policy, make sure to send it my way. Tell my audience where they can find you and, what you like them to do.
You can find me on YouTube, BitChute, and mine's at Keith Knight. Don't tread on anyone.
Right, great. And especially for the Minds people out there. I know I've been pushing it on my show for the past couple months. So check out Keith there. I'm at Immersion News on Minds. And then, thanks Keith for coming on.
Anytime, Kyle. Thank you for having me.